The Salem Witch Trials. I did my first video here on this channel called the Top 10 Disturbing Events from Salem You Weren't Taught in School. And if you haven't seen it, be sure to check it out. After all, the Salem Witch Trials in itself was a tragic and horrible time, and what happened to those prosecuted would suffer a calamitous fate beyond any form of redeemable recognition. Keep in mind, many things that I mention here on this list might be a little graphic in detail, so just be prepared as these are real things that happened during that chaotic time. Hi, my name is Jessa, and please join me as we look together our top 10 messed up things you never knew about the Salem Witch Trials. Oh, also in the last video I was in the top 10 historical locations in America that are haunted. I gave you guys a riddle. Did you get it? The riddle was, what can be touched but not be seen? The answer is, drumroll please, someone's heart. Aww. The next riddle will be at the end of this video. Anyways, let's get started. Number 10. Changes in the American legal system. Ever since the incident that occurred one fateful winter in 1692, the sparks of the famous Salem witch trials commenced, and the tragedies that would strike and shatter the many lives that have been reflected by the changes made by those whose roles are meant to protect them. When it came to the Puritans, they believed that physical realities had spiritual causes. If your crops failed, it was the devil who destroyed them. If your life was not devout and you suffered many forms of inconveniences, it was you who was responsible for letting the devil in. Satan could not take the form of an unwilling person, and so anyone who claimed to have seen a ghost or a spirit in any form of the accused, that person must be a witch. That person must be a witch. And the way their justice system worked was mainly based on a spectral evidence, meaning a form of legal evidence based on the testimonies of those who claimed to have experienced visions. And these spectral evidence reigned rampant during the Salem witch trials. And of course, this was the only basis of the evidence the Puritans believed, as it was their primary evidence used as proof of guilt. And so on May 27, 1692, Governor William Phips ordered the establishment of a special court known as the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which translates to hear and to determine. Without specific colony laws, judges would just accept spectral evidence, including testimonies about visions and dreams. At this time, Bridget Bishop was the first to be hanged on what was later called the Gallows Hill. Her crime was being a witch, but in reality it was because she just had gossip habits and promiscuity, which to the Puritans was the real crime. But calling her a witch was easier and considered justifiable. A few days after the court was established, respected Minister Cotton Mather wrote a letter importing to the court to not allow spectral evidence as it holds no reliable testimony to a crime and all basis of hypothetical and contradictions. Still, the court proceedings continued and sentenced 18 more hangings. Cotton's son, Increase Mather, then president of Harvard, denounced the use of spectral evidence, saying, in quote, "It would be better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned." But of course, this was only made into effect when the governor's own wife was accused of witchcraft, which when he finally dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, and in January 1693, the newly created Superior Court of Judicature began, and hearing the remaining witch trials. The judges could not accept spectral evidence, and most of the remaining trials ended in acquittal, meaning the judgment that a person is not guilty of the crime with which the person had been charged. Governor William Phips pardoned the rest, but the damage was already done, as so many had already died, been tortured, accused, and their reputations destroyed by their own communities. Number 9. The Devil's Mark. So when it came to the field courts protecting their own citizens' commend, it now begs the question, aside from spectral evidence, how did they identify you as a witch in the 17th century? Well, what determines you to be one, well, is if you had a mole, a skin deformity, skin tags, or birthmark, you just might be taken into custody for being a witch. By proper definition, according to the court system in Salem in the late 1600s, the witch's or devil's mark was believed to be the permanent marking where the devil himself initiated to seal their obedience and service to him. He is said to create these marks by ranking his claw across their flesh and licking the skin to produce a death skull pattern, or using a hot iron to produce a blue or red band. Of course, anything can look like these marks, as everyone was accusing anyone that they didn't like. So you could just have a birthmark or a mole, and they would be quick to say that you've been marked by the devil. Authorities would even go as far as routine strip downs and shave all of the body hair so that no potential mark could be hidden. Either way, many protests from the victims would state that these are natural marks on their bodies, but of course their objections were often, if not, always ignored. These assumptions had so many ramifications as it resulted in exclusion as well as execution. There are other theories that as far as the witch's mark goes. Historians are split into two groups in regarding to the subject, one that supports and doesn't support anthropologist Margaret Murray's theories on tattoos. Specific pagan tattoos were what the Puritans and many witch hunters were also looking for. At the time, the pagans, who will follow paganism, is a spiritual and religious practice under the belief of a polytheistic system, which of course to Puritans is a huge no-no. However, anything outside of Christianity was considered paganism. According to Murray, her theories was based on the ideology that Wicca and paganism practices, which like other religious practices, were targeted as they were more expressive in comparison to Christian beliefs, and society disapproved. So there were members that were just trying to keep their practice alive during this time. However, her theories are largely rejected by scientists and academics due to her lack of evidence. But personally, I think she might have a point, as it was pretty common as a historical standpoint that any cultural, religion, or traditional practice in these eras of times would be forced underground to avoid prosecution. For example, the Spanish Inquisition that flourished lands to prosecute Jews and Muslims. So again, humans just suck sometimes, just let people do what they want, it has nothing to do with you. Number 8. Witch's cake. I don't think Betty Crocker would add this in her line of bakery goods, considering a witch's cake isn't as delicious as it might sound. Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail, who claimed to have had visions, suffered from fits, and was speculated from eating rye bread or psychological trauma, as well as Ann Putnam Jr., who was friends with these girls. They all claimed that they were suffering from witchcraft. A local woman named Mary Sibley suggested that the enslaved servants of the Paris household, including Tituba, to bake a cake as a way to combat the dark magic. Following Mary's instructions, they made this so-called cake with a mix of the girl's urine and then feeding it to the family's dog. Don't know why, but that's what they were told. When the Reverend found out, he was pissed. Not only did the cake did nothing, but it made other people overhear these rumors and self-claim that they were also bewitched. The other accuser was Mary Walcott, who, by the way, was the daughter of a captain leader of Salem's militia. In fact, her aunt was Mary Sibley, the one who told and suggested to make the cake to begin with. Mary Walcott was definitely an actress, as I would say. She would make a fit one day in court and then relax knitting in the corner on other days. And whenever someone would point at her and say, "Is this person acting up and true?" she'd say yes. Still, she went on to accuse and testify, and claiming that she had fits and visions. One of the victims she testified was Giles Corey. If you remember from the other Salem video I mentioned, was on the Joshua Ward house. He was the victim who died from weight being pressed down onto his chest by none other than nepotism baby George Corwin, who was granted the position of High Sheriff. Ann Putnam Jr. is also part of the Putnam family, which again I mentioned in the other Salem video. The Putnams were rich Puritans who hated Sarah Osborne, one of the main first accused. And mainly it was because Sarah Osborne claimed land from her brother-in-law. Ann Putnam Jr. was only 12 years old at the time that she was used as one of the main prolific accusers during the trials, accusing over 60 people. Ann admitted guilt many years later, as she was the only one to even offer an apology to those she accused and the families that lost their loved ones. The families accepted her apology and actually reconciled with her. Anyways, in regards to the cake, the reason why Mary Sibley suggested the cake in the first place was because this was actually a traditional folk practice for anti-witchcraft, and it was actually widely known in England and the American colonies that dates back even way before the 1620s. But instead, it was used as a method to put Tituba and so many others into unjust torture and prosecution. Number 7. The prayer. Literacy was something not many were granted the privilege to learn or given the opportunity to learn, which is something a lot of us in our today's society take for granted. A test that they would use to identify those who are witches was reciting a prayer. Medieval wisdom suggests that witches are incapable of speaking scripture out loud, so accused witches were made to recite citations and selections from the Bible, usually the Lord's Prayer, and they had to do so without making a single mistake or omission. The problem with this tactic is those who are unable to read or have speech impediments or just simply nervous from the pressure of possibly dying. Any errors shown was sudden proof that the speaker was in league with the devil, and the test was commonly showcased in public. So again, if you hate public speaking, you needed to do so in order to prove your innocence. Just like in the case of Jane Wenham in 1712. She was an accused who was supposedly had difficulty speaking the words "forgive us our trespasses" and "lead us not into temptation" during her interrogation. Which again, those major phrases in the Lord's Prayer would be really essential to her innocence. Even if you were able to recite the scriptures in the Bible effortlessly, it still didn't guarantee your freedom. In a case of George Burgos, who was accused of being a sorcerer, flawlessly recited the prayer from the gallows just before his execution. But that didn't matter, as his prayer was dismissed and the procession continued, and he was hanged shortly after. Number 6. The touch test. It's like everything or anything you did back then in this era was just basically not witch-proof. They had a thing called the touch test, where the idea was if you were a victim of sorcery, you would have a special reaction to physical contact with the accused. In most cases, the possessed person would fall into a fit, and the suspected witch would be brought into the room and asked to lay their hand on them. If the person acted possessed continued, then it would mean the person is innocent. But if the possessed person stopped moving and came out of their fit, then that would mean the person who touched them was the one that put them under a spell to begin with. Very scientific, this type of evidence. A famous touch test was made in 1662 during the trial of Rose Cullender and Amy Denny, two elderly English women who were charged with bewitching a pair of young girls. The pair would be suffering from fits so much that they would clench their fists extremely tight to the point where it was impossible for even a strong man to pry their hands open. In the touch test, the judges would have the older women place their hands on the girls, and then suddenly their hands would open. To prove that the touch test was genuine, the judges would also have the girls blindfolded to touch the other members of the court. The girls would unclench their fists, which obviously suggested that they were faking the whole time. But nonetheless, the two elderly women were still convicted and were made out to be guilty. Rose and Amy would be later hanged as witches. witches. Number 5. Sleep deprivation. I used to do a lot of all-nighters in college when I used to study animation, and it was absolutely horrendous considering how barely I slept. But being forced to stay awake as a form of torture is something I didn't think I'd find on this list during the witch trials. Sleep deprivation was used as a means to interrogate by witch hunters during the witch hunt craze. Even though I mentioned Increased Mathers earlier, the president of Harvard in the list, how he said spectral evidence was not enough to condemn a witch, that didn't exclude other methods to see if someone was guilty. He would also use sleep deprivation as a tactic to see if the accused are who they say they were. He would use this method to accuse these victims by tying them to a chair and screaming sermons on eternal damnation. And I'll be honest, if someone was screaming at me like that while I'm trying to go to sleep, I'll probably still pass out. But if I did, they would splash water on me, put fire under my seat, whatever it took to make sure I'd stayed awake to confess that I was a witch or not. Which, to be honest, many on this list so far makes no sense, as evident on how ridiculous their methods were to prove if someone was a witch. Number 4. The Ducking Stool. The following on this list will be a bit graphic, so I'm just warning you now, so just be prepared. In regards to the witch trials, since the judicial court system was useless and it would take in spectral evidence, again up until the governor himself had to change the rules to save his wife, as well as the identification of one being a witch like the witch's or devil's mark, the methods they used to torture and suffering on those persecuted were inhumane, brutal, heartless, merciless, and barbaric. Dunking stools, much like dunking the witch, was a punishment on witches, mainly women, where they would be strapped to a chair where they were dunked into rivers or lakes. Originally used as a punishment for disorderly women, scolds, and dishonest tradesmen in medieval Europe, this then turned into one of the many methods of torture and public humiliations during the witch trials. Instead of the accused being on a chair, they would actually be hung from their toe or their thumbs and then dunked into the water. Majority would die from the shock of the freezing temperatures, but more so from the pain and injury in these methods. If the witch, again in most of these cases, women, were thrown into the river or deep pond and she floated, she was in league with the devil somehow, and as it would be seen as she's rejecting baptismal water. If she sank, then she would be clear of her crimes and obviously she would have been dead. So either way, you were dead regardless of the result. Number 3. The Heretic's Fork. Typically used as a tool during the medieval times for mainly heretics. Either way, being accused of witchcraft was seen as heresy, as any form of deviation from the church and high political leaders bestowed by God was pretty much heresy. But alas, they did what they wanted to do if it means punishing the wicked and their lack of devotion. So they used also what is known as a heretic's fork. Again, pretty graphic in detail, and I apologize in advance. The device consisted of 2 opposing bi-pronged metal forks that was attached to a belt or a strap. The device was placed between your chest bone and throat, just under the chin, and secured with a leather strap around the neck, while the victim hung from the ceiling or otherwise suspended in a way so that they couldn't relax or lie down. Apparently this is what Increased Mathers also used on Tituba during her times in the Gowls. Number 2. Pricking and scratching. When I mentioned the devil's mark or witch's mark back in number 9, even if the individual was stripped down and shaved and they had no distinguishing marks on them, they still believed in invisible marks, so they would still prick the individual with knives or special needles anyway. Witch hunting books and instruction pamphlets, yes, they had IKEA-like manuals on how to prick a witch. It noted that the marks were insensitive to pain and they couldn't bleed. So they would make these specially designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced their desired result. So basically, they would just keep poking you with needles until there was an area where you didn't bleed. They even had a job position for this called professional prickers, which would be con men who would use dulled needle points to identify fake witch marks. Alongside the pricking was the scratching, where they would scratch the supposed victim. So if a victim scratches the accused witch with their fingernails and drew blood and their symptoms would just stop, then somehow that person they scratched was a witch. Again, very dumb. I hate these tests. I don't like them. Number 1. Hanging. Although it's noted that the most famous form of torture and method of getting rid of a witch was to burn her or burn them by the stake. But this was a more common thing in Europe during the very early 1300s to the end of the 17th century. In England and most of their colonies, the witch trials would go on like every other crime, and when someone was convicted of witchcraft, typically they would be hanged. But in cases to be tried by courts ran by the church, they would be treated as heresy, as that was the actual crime associated with burning at the stake, not witchcraft. Burning to the church was a way to purify those convicted and also to uncover conspiracies against the church, as church authorities in Europe fully believed that people would make conspiracies with the devil against them, which includes criticizing the church or the head of state, anything that would allow the average person to question on who's leading them. As for those in Salem, hanging was the main form of execution. The bodies of those hanged were dumped in the location near Proctor's Ledge, an area that has a shallow rocky crevice between a ledge. There are notes of reference of several bodies being removed at night by family members and buried by their homes, and although there have been many attempts recently trying to recover the bodies of those hanged, sadly it's been unsuccessful. Today, there are memorials dedicated to the victims of the Salem witch trials, those whose names are known and unknown, like Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who was considered the last woman who was accused of witchcraft. Luckily, she did not die under the trials, but her case was still on her as being accused as a witch. She tried to set a petition for exoneration in 1712, but her request was never heard in court. She was believed to have died in 1747 at the age of 77 in an unmarked grave. But then, her case was finally exonerated 329 years later with the help of grade 8 middle schoolers in Massachusetts, who worked over a year to prove her case and finally clear her name. Did you learn anything interesting today? Let me know. Oh, right! Your next riddle. Are you ready? What gets broken without being held? Be sure to put your answer in the comments below and I will reveal the answer in the next video. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jessa. Be sure to like and subscribe and I'll see your beautiful faces in the next one. Bye bye!